So I know we're all eager to dive right into today's topic. So I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Arnaud Delorme. So for those of you who don't know, Arnaud is a CNRS principal investigator in Toulouse, France, a member faculty at the University of California, San Diego, and a scientist here at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He developed the free EEG lab software for advanced analysis of EEG signals, which is now amongst the most used in EEG research worldwide. Dr. Delorme has a keen interest in the scientific study of consciousness and spirituality, which is why he's here at IONS as well. And he's a long-time Zen meditator and has taught in India on the neural correlates of conscious experience in a master's degree program for the Birla Institute of Technology. And starting in 2002, he started to look at brain changes underlying extraordinary states of consciousness, including meditation, psychoactive agents, and mediumship. So we'll be getting into more of that. And so Arnaud, thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you to give a little context for our webinar today, and then introduce our special guest.
Thank you, Andrea. So our special guest today is Jonathan Schooler. Jonathan is a dear friend and an American psychologist and professor of psychological and brain science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He researches various topics in cognitive psychology and philosophy, such as belief in free will, meta-awareness, mindfulness, mind-wandering, memory, creativity, emotions, everything that has to do with consciousness, basically. He's particularly interested in exploring phenomena that intersect between the empirical and the philosophical, such as the nature of consciousness. And he's also known sometimes for dwelling on controversial topics, like we do at IONS on anomalous cognition, psi, and the decline effect. So we're going to discuss all that, hopefully. Dr. Schooler is the author or co-author of more than 200 published scientific papers or chapters. He has appeared in numerous popular media and TV shows, including the BBC, a TV special, NPR, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Times Magazine, the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Scientific American, Wired Magazine, and many more. And congratulations are in order because he had just been promoted distinguished professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is the highest possible level. I think there's about 10 levels, and that's like the very top you can be. And I don't think that many people actually get there. So I'm a big fan. When you're an aspiring scientist, you look up to your peer, and that's one of the person I look up to. So I'm very honored to have him here. It's a big inspiration. So please, Jonathan.
Thank you, Arnaud. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been a long time fan of IONS. I think IONS really has an important place in terms of keeping open frontier science and maintaining an open mind and encouraging scientists to explore possibilities that maybe many of them have just sort of dismissed out of hand. And one of the key things that I'm going to really be sort of focusing on today is this idea of keeping an open mind and not being too locked into particular perspectives of any sort. It's a perspective that I call entertaining without endorsing. So I'm going to do a pretty substantial whirlwind of some rather controversial ideas. And so I hope that you can adopt this entertaining without endorsing perspective. So, all right, let's see if this works. Oops. Okay, can you see my screen all right?
We can, but it's in presenter mode, so we can see the other slides down below.
Okay, let's try that again. Try it one more time, share screen. How's that?
Perfect.
Great. So again, I want to encourage people to take an open mind and to sort of entertain without endorsing. That said, what I'm going to do right now is actually zero in on the three things that I feel the most confident about of anything in my existence. So I'm going to call these three self-evident truths. And I mean, I think there may be a little wiggle room on these, but they seem really, really compelling to. The first is that I'm having an experience. This is a sort of the essence of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. At every moment that you are awake, it seems self-evident that you're having an experience. Some have suggested that experience itself could be an illusion. For me, experience is more certain even than physical reality. The second is that what defines my experience is intrinsically dynamic. Even if I'm looking at a still slide, there's still the flow of experience. So experience is defined by change, by movement in time. And the third is that experience is always now. I can imagine the past, I can project myself into the future, but even those imaginations are happening always in the present. And the interesting thing that really encourages, I think, some scientific humility is the fact that three absolutely self-evident truths are at odds with, are totally unexplained by existing science. So with respect to science, there's no way to explain how subjective experience arises. This is what Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. And this has led some very eminent philosophers to question whether consciousness even exists at all. Daniel Dennett suggests we're all zombies, that nobody is conscious because there's just no way to fit it in to the existing scientific models. Others acknowledge consciousness, but very few people think that they have an explanation, even a remote explanation for it. We can come to the ITT theory later on, but even there, I think they'd recognize their real limits. In addition to no explanation for consciousness, the flow of time is considered to be an illusion. Einstein famously said, the past, present, future are all illusions, even if stubborn ones. And Paul Davies said, nothing in known physics corresponds to the passage of time. Indeed, physicists insist that time doesn't flow at all, it merely is. So why is it? How could possibly the idea of a flow of time be an illusion? And the reason for this has to do with the way that physicists think about time. They imagine time in what's known, and this stems out of relativity theory, is known as a block universe, where essentially the past, the present, and the future are all simply just different locations in an addition of time. So here, the three dimensions of space have been collapsed into two, and you can see each moment in time as a slice and stretched out. So here we have the Big Bang, and things are gradually playing themselves out. So in our experience, we experience events like this. This will be a little jerky, but you should get the idea of things move in time. But from the perspective of the block universe, every slice is existing simultaneously. So you're already conscious in every moment. There's no way to be moving because you're already in every moment already. So herein lies the rub. And I think this is really important as we encourage ourselves to keep an open mind about our understanding of physical reality. Science provides absolutely no way of conceptualizing the three things of which I'm most certain: experience, the flow of time, and the uniqueness of now. And so this suggests what I'm arguing is ontological humility and appreciation that we really don't understand the foundations of existence, and relatedly, what I would call spiritual humility, which is basically recognizing that there are many different ways of thinking about how mind consciousness might relate to the physical universe, and no one has got the goods on that yet. So we need to really keep an open mind for possible ways of thinking about it, and being open to maybe perspectives not like the ones that we ourselves hold. So I certainly want to acknowledge that I'm going to be presenting one perspective, but I think there are many other very defensible ones. And it raises the possibility, given how we can't explain the things of which we, I think, arguably can be the most certain about, that we're going to need to rethink how subjectivity fits into the foundation of science. And so that's what I want to do for the remainder of this brief presentation, is give one possible, quite possibly far-fetched, but nevertheless, I'm trying to think about how could we fit subjectivity into the formula. So my view is that what's missing, at least in part, this isn't the full thing, is how can you move through the block universe if consciousness is already in every block simultaneously? And the postulation is that perhaps we're short at least a degree of freedom. In order to be able to move through the block universe, we need to have an additional dimension by which we're moving through the block universe relative to something. So this leads to the idea of a subjective dimension of time. Now, we already experience this. Sometimes time seems like it's going very fast. Other times it seems like it's going very slow. Clock time, of course, is always constant relativity, leaving that aside for the moment. But we definitely have changes in the experience of the flow of time. And so the idea is that there's a dimension of subjective time relative to objective time, and that we're moving in objective time relative to subjective time. So as I mentioned before, this is the way that we would experience if in a block universe, you experience everything all at once. There's nothing that's moving. But if we add an additional dimension of subjectivity to it, then we can move through it. So now we can move through this block universe, and notice how now the dynamics, all the things that are missing in time emerge once we have this additional dimension. Let me present this in another way. So before I showed you a block universe where I had the 3 dimensions of space reduced to 2. Now I'm going to reduce them to 1. So we have physical space here and objective time here, and this is the observer, and the observer is in every moment simultaneously. So there's nothing to move; they're already everywhere. But if we introduce a subjective dimension, now the observer can move through physical space or objective time relative to subjective time, and actually have moment by moment by moment, where each moment is the successive moment of now. So again, by introducing a subjective dimension of time, we find a place for the flow of time and for the privileged present of now. And you can see that by adding this additional dimension, we can move through the block universe. So here we're just taking steps in the one relative to the other, and now all of a sudden we can move through it. Now, the way that I was imagining it here was as steps going up, where the observer is moving up. But just in the same way that you can shift the frame of ground, or you can imagine, rather than you moving up, time coming down. So we're essentially moving up in subjective time, forward in objective time, but the future is actually coming towards us. So we're always a single frame moving in subjective time relative to objective time, constantly going up the down escalator, essentially. So what defines an individual moment? Well, one way of thinking about it is it's the capacity to make a temporal discrimination. If you see 2 flashes and if you experience them as separate flashes, then they would be outside of a window in 2 separate windows, whereas if both flashes seem like they happened at once, then that would appear to be a single moment. So in fact, a fluorescent light is flashing very quickly, but we don't notice that flash. And indeed, different animals have different flicker fusion rates. That's at what rate do they see multiple flashings as being in the same moment. And smaller animals actually seem to have a more fine-grained temporal resolution than larger ones. They have a faster flicker fusion rate. And so what this suggests then is that different observers may be moving in objective time relative to subjective time at different rates. So it's possible that a fly is having lots and lots of steps, whereas we're having fewer steps. So the reason why it's so hard to swat a fly is because to the fly, when you swat it, it looks like you're going like this. So the fact that we can differently move in objective time versus subjective time also could help to explain differences between organisms. Now, I want to introduce one more idea before sort of tying it all together. And this is the idea of nested observer windows. And have you ever seen these images? So this is a picture, which is itself made out of smaller pictures. And the idea is that this may be the way that our conscious systems are organized. We may have lower level windows, which are then serving as pixels to higher level windows, which are themselves pixels to higher level windows, and so on. And so we might imagine that each one of these individual levels is a window, and then also looking out on lower level windows. And quite possibly in the sort of panpsychist model, each one of these individual windows may be having its own subjective experience, may be actually moving in objective time relative to subjective time. I think it's quite plausible that our individual neurons are having subjective experience, that our individual networks are having an individual experience, and that we're sort of, or the consciousness that we most identify with is sort of the furthest one back. All right. In addition to postulating a subjective dimension of time, I want to also postulate a third dimension of time. So now, again, entertaining without endorsing, let's just consider this possibility. You know, in physics, there's already this idea of many worlds, the idea that we may be splitting universes all the time, branching off with this one universe in which the cat is dead, and another universe in which the cat is living, and we're constantly splitting off. And this actually turns out to be a now increasingly mainstream account of quantum mechanics. So if we're prepared to entertain the possibility that we may actually be able to split off into alternative causal chains, then another possibility is that consciousness is, in addition to moving through objective relative to subjective time, is able to choose or in some way move between alternative next moments, so that rather than having just a single next possible moment, the block universe is actually a block multiverse that is branching. And this would then provide potentially an opportunity for thinking about free will, because it may be that if we're moving between multiple possible alternative dimensions in this alternative time, that we have, the consciousness could have some control. Okay, this is probably my most wild slide, or maybe not. I've got a few more after that. But essentially, what you see here is this idea that we're moving, we're a frame that's staying still in time, we're a frame that's fixed. The future is coming at us, and we're able to turn into alternative dimensions. So in an ambiguous situation, our interpretation might turn us towards the more ducky path or the more rabbity path, and then we choose one, and that choice then becomes the history, and it becomes locked in. I think that this raises a whole host of interesting perspectives about the possible nature of reality. But even if it doesn't work as a good explanation of reality, it might make for a fun, I'm going to skip, it might make for a fun video game. So I'm imagining that you could translate this theory into a virtual reality game in which you are moving through objective and subjective and alternative time, taking your choices and recognizing the way in which through your choices you different alternative futures pan out. You could lean forward and zoom in, lean backwards and zoom out and slow down time. You could turn and the very same perspective experience either in one way or another. And then you could actually see the path of your movement through the cone of time. All right, I've given you a very whirlwind tour through what could be called a toy model of time and consciousness. I've suggested that time may involve 3 dimensions: objective time or clock time, subjective time or time as it's experienced, and alternative time, the many branches of possibilities. And I think that this is just, of course, just one possible model, but it's a way of thinking about how can we integrate subjective experience into our views of physical reality, and possibly in so doing help to account for some of the major mysteries, or at least provide a way to think about some of the major mysteries of the flow of time, the nature of experience, and the privilege present of now. I've also suggested the idea of nested observer windows, and importantly, the idea of nested observer windows does not require you to buy into the 3 dimensions of time. They're separate ideas, but the idea that we may be a hierarchical organization of windows upon windows upon windows, where each window is its own subjective experience, which is integrating lower level windows and then serving as the equivalent metaphorically of a pixel for higher level windows. And if we are if what the self that you identify with is a window, it raises the possibility perhaps each one of us is a pixel in yet some larger window, which could then be a pixel in some larger window, and so on. So it raises the possibility of perhaps even higher order levels of consciousness. These are all just attempts at thinking about open-minded perspectives of how we bridge this objective-subjective divide, which I think is a really, really fundamental question. If you have more questions, I invite you to ask them during this discussion. And let me also direct you to my website. If you just Google MetaLab UCSB, you'll find me there. All my papers are there, including this one, Bridging the Objective-Subjective Divide, and this one, Entertaining Without Endorsing the Case for Scientific Investigation of Anomalous Cognition. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to our conversation, Arno.
Thanks, Jonathan. And so, yeah, I'm going to start with some questions of my own, just, trying to peek in and understand better your model. So if we understand the subjective time dimension, can this be interpreted, in string theory, there's like 13 dimensions, etc. Can this be interpreted as the extra dimension, or are you saying that like the fly has its own dimension, I have my own dimension, you have your own dimension, we're all in different dimensions? Or can we have just one dimension and we're moving at different speed on the, I don't know, can you clarify that?
Yeah, well, one of the things I want to emphasize is I see this as just sort of an initial entree, bare bones scaffolding. And I think there are a lot of different ways you could take this. I think it would be possible to create a separate dimensions for everybody, and but I also think that it would be more elegant if we could if there was a sort of a single dimension of subjective time that every window was moving differently through and had different coordinates in. So my first pass would be to try to just make subjective time a singular dimension, and that would also make it easier perhaps to have these sort of combined experiences, and where we might become synchronized. And I think that if it is the case that there's a single dimension that we're all moving through, that what defines each individual is our own unique frequency in moving through it. All our different pixels are all jumping in subjective relative to objective time at precisely the same rate, and it's that synchronization what may enable for what's known as the binding problem, where the individual bits are experienced together.
So it would be like we all have, along that dimension, we are all like sine waves at different frequencies, and that's why we're not conscious of each other's thoughts unless we become synchronized, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Then, yeah, another question was, so you mentioned this different zooming, like
Mhm.
pixelation, etc. So is there a relationship between the size and the passage of time? Like the smaller you are, the faster the time goes, like the fly, I remember
That's the conjecture.
yeah.
Yeah, and I actually think that may be one of the places where the experience where these things could lead to at least first pass tests. So as I mentioned, there already is evidence that smaller organisms have a faster flicker fusion rate than larger organisms, which would suggest that they may be moving through subjective time, relative to objective time at a slower rate. And it also makes sense that our lower level systems are processing information faster and have a faster flicker fusion rate or a faster temporal grain size. And that could explain how reflexes can be so fast and how fingers can move, faster than the mind can think. And in contrast, when you're having these sort of big abstract conversations, it feels like time just flies by, right? And that may be because we're taking these moments of big chunks of information. We're really sort of stepping back and holding a lot of information in every chunk, but every chunk is subsuming more objective time.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense with respect. I mean, if we go down to the photons, we don't experience the passage of time at all. For the photons, everything is instantaneous because they go at the speed of light. So there's no time for photons, and so along these lines, do you think in your models, are photon conscious? Does it go down to the individual particles, or does it stop like at the fly or the bacteria? Where does consciousness?
I am open to it going all the way, turtles all the way down. I think that's a really intriguing notion. Along with my collaborator, Tam Hunt, we've written a number of papers on sort of a panpsychic view where it may go all the way. I don't think it. I think you're exactly right. At the level of the photon, there's no opportunity. So there may not be at that level, but at other levels there may be a hint of consciousness. The bottom line is that a miracle happens somewhere, right? Somewhere along the line, consciousness occurs, and wherever you put the miracle, it's still a miracle. If it happens at the bottom, that's amazing. If it happens just at the level of the reticular activation system, or wherever you want to, or the frontal cortex, wherever you want to put it, the brain, it's the shift from objective to subjective is just essentially inexplicable. So the convenience about panpsychism is you just take that as an axiom. You just assume consciousness is in everything, and that you don't need to also explain why it occurs at a particular later time. At the same time, I think it's very possible that there's something about emergence, that maybe the miracle happens somewhere in between, that there's some level of complexity which is required before it starts having momentum in the subjective dimension. I feel when I look at sort of the behavior of bacteria and one cell organisms, they mate, they seek food, they learn. There's all sorts of stuff that's going on there. So I think it's very plausible that consciousness may happen at that level. But I also think it's possible that there may be some sort of global workspace, which is really where consciousness takes place, and then it's maybe limited to higher levels. And one of the things to do is to look at the relationship between levels and see, is there one level where the idea of nested observer windows is that it's like a fractal pattern, the same information processing relationships of information integration are happening at multiple levels. If consciousness goes all the way down, then you'd expect the same sort of relationship between the elements to happen all the way up. Whereas if consciousness emerges at one particular place, then the information integration processes at one level should be qualitatively different from the information integration processes at other levels.
Okay, another question on your model. So, I mean, on the continuum, you know, and you can put down the continuum if you don't agree with it, of, you know, idealism on one side, which is like consciousness is everything, you know, the real world is an illusion. And, or on the other side, materialism, you know, consciousness is an illusion, it doesn't exist. Where does, you know, your fear, is it in the middle? Is it more on the idealism side, or?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think things can be like, I think neutral monism is sort of the space where that I like, where we're sort of looking at two sides of a it's neither material nor conscious, but somehow embodies both. That said, if between materialism and idealism, I think they both. I think idealism is underestimated. Like everybody, you know, in my world would characterize themselves as a materialist, and if they describe themselves otherwise, you know, they're considered to be a radical. And I think the goods on materialism is far from clear, in the sense that I'm certain that subjectivity exists. The existence of an objective world independent of consciousness is just an inference. So it's funny that we come down favoring the material over the conscious when forced to choose between the two.
Okay, now before we take some questions, I'd like to, you know, compare and contrast some I would like you to compare and contrast, you know, like your theory with other theories of consciousness, such as integrated information theory, which I think is the most accepted theory right now by, you know, neuroscientists and physicists. Although, I mean, you know, you can argue it doesn't explain much, but it's the hypothesis that consciousness emerges from complexity. It's like the more complex a system is, the more conscious it becomes. And so this was designed by Tononi, Giulio Tononi. And there's been lots of controversy around that hypothesis, in the sense that if you have actually a very complex network, binary units, and you know, it's doing almost nothing, it's just doing and or things, and then Tononi said, yeah, I'll have to agree that this is conscious, because this is a very complex system. So, I mean, there's definitely problems, but yeah, what do you think of that theory of, you know, the mainstream theory right now?
Well, first, I have to admit that there's a level to the math that I simply don't understand. So I can't comment on the intricacies of the mathematics, although I understand that I'm not alone on this, that many people have not really fully grokked the mathematics behind it. But that said, there's a number of things that, from my understanding of it, I quite like. It takes consciousness as being a fundamental aspect of the universe, of physical reality. That consciousness is in a certain sense a given. It is equal to integrating information. And the idea that we take consciousness, rather than trying to figure out how it arises, but rather accept it as an axiom, I think is a very valuable move. We take other things as axioms, and to me, there's nothing more axiomatic than consciousness. So I very much like that. I also very much like the idea of information integration being absolutely sort of critical to the process of consciousness. And in the nested observer window model, what you see, it's really a model of information integration. It's every pixel is integrating the lower level windows, which are low, or every window is integrating the lower level windows and themselves contributing to higher level windows. So as you move up in the window level, you get increasingly greater information integration. So the basic sort of notion of information integration is nicely mapped on to this thing. It's also possible that you could think about quantifying movement in a subjective time as in relationship to information integration theory. I think that there are a lot of possible alternative ways to think about information integration, and I hope that people use that theory as an example, but don't have it limit them as the only way of thinking about the ways in which the axioms of consciousness may exist and how information integration relates to that.
Okay, yeah, and I wanted also to throw in the discussion I don't know if you know the Gödel's theorem. You might not have any comment on that, but you know the Gödel's incompleteness theorem state that in mathematics there's true statements. So we know they're true, but we can't demonstrate them. It's just impossible to demonstrate them. So maybe, you know, maybe consciousness is like that. No, maybe we know it is true, but you know we can't explain it with the laws of physics. I don't know. Do you have any comments on that?
I think that's exactly right. I think that we need that consciousness may be one of the fundamental things that we can't explain because it's an axiom. It is the ground on which we build our theories, and it's like the fish can't get out of the water to see it. We can't get the perspective to fully explain it. But that's not to say that by taking it as a particular kind of axiom, we can see in the same way, you know, look how far Euclid made it with his axioms. Once you identify your axioms, you can then build on those axioms and create self-coherent models. And I think that there's a real opportunity here for us to generate models about how consciousness fits into the physical reality. And the thing that I really like is to try to make them accessible. And so what I've been trying to do with this 3 dimensions of time model is to translate these abstract ideas into something that's embodied, that we can represent in our own minds and then play with and build with. And so I'd invite people to, how can I imagine, how could you actually create a representation of this and think about it? And recognizing that there are limitations of representations, you don't want to confuse the representation necessarily with the reality, but by having that representation, we can maybe think more deeply about some of these issues.
Okay, and yeah, I invite also Andrea to look at the questions, because I don't think there's so many questions. I don't think I'll have time to, dwell on them all. But just to continue on, different theories of consciousness, I'd like you to talk a little bit about quantum theories of consciousness. How does, your theory relates to quantum theories of consciousness, especially the main one for which there is limited, scientific evidence, which is it's called the orchestrated objective reduction. So that's the microtubule theory of Penrose and Hamroth. Penrose was Nobel Prize of Physics, one of the most brilliant physicists. And yeah, I don't think it gives a solution like integrated information theory to the prime of consciousness. It just says where consciousness emerged from these quantum interactions in the brain. So how does it fit in your model?
I think that it's very likely that you could integrate my model with that model. I've talked to Stuart Hamroth about my model, and he's not that enthusiastic about the additional dimensions of time aspect. But to me, I think that it could well be integrated. The model that I'm introducing definitely has a potential relationship to quantum models in its introduction of alternative time and the possibility that that the future is not fixed, but that there are multiple possible futures, and that consciousness may even be able to have some navigational capacity in terms of which quantum reality it collapses. So there's definitely, it's in the same spirit. And then also the way in which really gives consciousness its own due in the model as opposed to sort of sweeping it under the rug, I think is very important. And then also their model has a bang, bang, bang. It's got this, there's a flicker in the model in terms of the rate of moving through time that I think is consistent with the ways that that I've been thinking about things. I think the idea of microtubules is quite ingenious in the sense of finding a particular sort of space, biological size in which quantum effects could be sufficiently insulated to enable their causal role to take place. And they've been successful in showing evidence that quantum effects can happen in warm brains, which was one of the major criticisms of the model. At the same time, they're very, very wedded to that particular model, saying it's like this, and I think that it remains a viable candidate, but I would just encourage people not to just sort of go, okay, it's like this, but rather stay open to additional alternative perspectives.
Yeah, and I also like, I mean, the thing I like about in your theory is that, you know, you can also consider consciousness as a field of physics. And I mean, in string theory, for example, even time and space can be considered as fields. And then in your theory, you also have this many world. So many world is the main interpretation of quantum mechanics, because you don't have to deal with the collapse of the wave function. Mm-hmm. It just branches to a different universe. So it just makes it simpler. And in your model, it's that consciousness could just be another field of physics, like electromagnetism or the strong force that binds atoms together. And then I have the same kind of quantum behavior branching. The only difference is that in your model, the branching is due to free will. And so I mean, from my as a scientist, from my perspective, isn't like adding this dimension of branching and free will just something that's unnecessarily complicated, and you might not need that. You know, there's a lot of questions in the neuroscientific community. We don't need free will. Free will is just something that complicates. Just, you know, we're conscious, we might not have free will. What do you think?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important to keep that that option open. You could totally do the same model and have the windows moving with no control whatsoever. So it would be a piece of cake to revamp the model to eliminate free will. The thing I like about it is it at least provides there's a way, it provides a window for free will to possibly be re-emerged into sort of a physicalist perspective, but you could totally get rid of it. In fact, you could get rid of the alternative time dimension and just have the two dimensions, which I've talked about before, and just have us moving through the single block universe at different rates. So there's all sorts of variations on the model that could be defensible. I will say that I think there's a little bit of backwards thinking in getting rid of something which feels as self-evident as free will based on our conclusions about causality and our understanding of the physical universe, when we really don't understand, even going back to Hume, we don't even really understand causality. So there's a little bit of a, I think, metaphysical throwing the baby out with the bathwater in dismissing free will out of hand based on our current level of understanding of the physical reality. And the Libet studies, I'm familiar with all that research, and they may well ultimately in the day indicate that we have absolutely no free will, but there's still enough room of individual differences in the way that people behave in different circumstances that I think for those of us who are inclined to want to think that free will in the libertarian kind of perspective might be viable, there's still a case to be made.
Yeah, let me ask one more question before we go into the audience question, because I think it's a question that's like important for ions. I mean, on the nature of free will, I mean, I wanted to mention, like, if we consider the consciousness as a field, like the standard field of physics, at very, very high energy, they all emerge. So consciousness must have free will because, it is linked to everything in the world. So in a sense, it's all entangled. So in that, in that interpretation must have free will. But I wanted you to, before we take the question from the audience, comment on psi. So telepathy, clairvoyance, how does that fit in your model? Do you think these are viable hypotheses, or if it can't fit, possibly, or what is your take on all? And I know you've done many experiments on these yourself in your lab.
Yeah. So I think that in terms of forcing mainstream science to seriously take consciousness seriously as having properties that are not currently recognized, psi may be the best hope. There's been a lot of psi studies and a lot of positive psi results. We've been studying psi in my lab for quite some time. That said, there's no psi result that I know of that can be consistently replicated, and the usage of pre-registration, where you say we're going to do this study, pre-register exactly how you're going to do it and what results you're going to get, and then find those results in the context of psi. There are very few, if any, successful pre-registered psi studies, and those are going to be required, because the bottom line is that what can happen in psi, and this has happened in my lab, is you find something and then you replicate it, and you don't find it where you found it before, but you find it over here. And then you go, oh, okay, so it's over here. But then you replicate it again, and it's not there, it's over here. And so, but that could happen possibly because there's some sort of moving target, and there are some psi theories that explain that. But it could also be that something known as p-hacking, where if you look at the data enough possible ways, you'll find something somewhere. And so until we get well-established, robustly replicable psi results, it's going to be problematic. Now, this has to be contextualized within this idea of the decline effect, which actually Dean Radin introduced me to long ago when I told him about my first precognition result. And he said, well, did you replicate it? And I said, well, once it will keep replicating, it will decline. And I'm like, what? Sure enough, it did decline. And this is a well-known thing. And we've been studying the decline effect. And there's a bit of a long story here, but the bottom line is that we may have found the decline effect, and then it declined. Effect sizes get smaller and smaller. And so it may be that there's some sort of twisted thing where you'll never really be able to show these kinds of effects. Last thing I want to say on this is I think there's also a real possibility that psi kinds of effects could be operative at the individual level, personal level, but for complex reasons that maybe eventually we can understand, maybe not, we won't be able to demonstrate them as definitively at the larger level. And there's actually some ways in which the geometry of the 3 dimensions of time sort of moving up the cone, you can wiggle more as an individual than you can wiggle as a group. And so it may be that the individual wiggle of the individual allows for individual psi, but as we try to do larger and larger studies connecting more and more consciousnesses, the reduction in wiggle room prevents psi from being observed.
Andrea, do you have any questions from the audience?
Yes, so thank you everyone for putting your questions and your comments in. You can continue putting your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote. So if you have a question that you see on the queue that you want answered, you can like a question and it'll pop it further up on our list. But we do have several questions around how the brain fits into your hypothesis. So do you believe that the brain activates or generates the mind? Or just in general, I'd love to hear from you, Jonathan, and any other comments from you, Arno, about how does the brain tie into your hypothesis?
So my thoughts on the brain is that the brain is in fact a a set of nested observer windows that are sort of stacked, and we have lots and lots of lower ones. And so you can imagine these windows upon windows upon windows. And the way in which these windows are orchestrated is through resonance, that the lower level windows are vibrating very, very fast. And then those are through cross-frequency coupling, integrating to higher level ones, which are integrating to higher level ones, and so on. Individual windows are having sort of a singular experience through synchronization, and windows that are at the same level are orchestrating with each other through coherence. So I think that it's possible that you could create a model that would nest essentially that kind of structure of nested observer windows into the 3 dimensions of time model. Although critically, because I am working on the nested observer window model, you can totally have this nested observer window element without having to throw in the 3 dimensions of time. They're different frontier ideas. And even with respect to the nested observer windows, it's possible that the lower level windows may or may not have consciousness. You imagine that consciousness only emerges at the highest level, say the global workspace.
Yeah, my personal theory about the brain and consciousness right now might change in a year. Is the brain is like a particle accelerator, or like, in fusion research, it's like holding the plasma, and the plasma is consciousness. And so consciousness is like a field of physics, but we don't know yet. We haven't, discovered its property. And like other fields, it can be contained. Like we can contain electron in a plasma. So the brain is a machine to contain consciousness, and consciousness is everywhere, but it's more concentrated in some part, and that's what the brain is doing. It doesn't mean you can't beam consciousness. It doesn't mean consciousness depends on the brain. I mean, that's my current take on it. I don't think it's incompatible with Jonathan's.
No, it's not incompatible at all. It's completely compatible. It's particularly if you imagine this subjective dimension as being a fundamental dimension of reality, then we're all tapping into that.
Absolutely. So we have some questions, combining a few questions here. One from Brian: is consciousness and life dependent on one another, or can they exist without the other? And we had a couple questions of consciousness beyond death, consciousness beyond body. So maybe you can comment on that as well.
Okay. So again, this is where I think it's really important to maintain spiritual humility and to recognize that there are defensible perspectives, and that from my vantage, no one can claim, I mean, everyone is entitled to feeling like they've got the goods on it, but intersubjectively, I don't think anybody does. And so I'll just give you some of my reflections on that challenging topic. The first is that if subjectivity is a intrinsic characteristic property of reality, then that would mean that it wouldn't necessarily require brains or biology to be held. And indeed, it's possible that even things such as strings might even have some kind of proto consciousness to them. Also, I'll put this out there too. One of the interesting things that's come up in physics is this notion that this is not the first Big Bang, but that there were like big banging and big banging and big banging. And that's just the possibility that that big bangs have been happening for an eternity. And we know that consciousness can emerge as a result of big bangs. So if we know that consciousness can emerge as a result of big bangs, and if big bangs have been happening for eternity, then that means consciousness has arisen, who knows how many times. And also just look at how fast our consciousness has been evolving. Where's it going? Imagine an infinity of opportunities for consciousness to arise and for it to try to figure out what it's doing, what's going on, and try to maintain itself. Given that, the idea that we could be in some kind of simulation created by consciousness to sustain itself seems completely plausible to me. And so I feel like we may well be the sort of playing out the process of a conscious existing in a conscious simulation, which is creating all these experiences for its own entertainment, or or progress, or whatever. Who's to say what its motives are, or even if it knows it's doing it? Yeah,
and so I want to resonate with that question as well. Actually, it stole my question. I had kept the question, for Jonathan, what happens to consciousness after death? And so maybe you can actually answer more specifically that question. But I was at the Mind and Life seminars, which are retreats for scientists on meditation retreats to study the subjective aspects of consciousness. And we had a Rinpoche, so somebody that was just under the Dalai Lama, teaching us. And he said, what happens to consciousness after death? Nobody has ever come back to tell us. And so this was his answer. So, that kind of approach that Jonathan is prone to be open to possibility. I think about consciousness and death, what happens to consciousness after death, and especially personal consciousness. I mean, we can think of just awareness. We're all aware. So, after we die, our awareness is not gone because it's everybody. But what about personal consciousness? The most convincing evidence we have are of terminal lucidity, where we have patients, we have like extensive brain tumor, like their brain tumor is everywhere in their brain, and they've been in the coma, for years, or completely delirious, and just before dying, for 5 minutes, they come back and they have a discussion with their loved one, and these are documented cases. So this is our most tangible proof that consciousness, might not rely entirely on the brain. And so this goes on to my question, which I wanted to ask Jonathan. Where does our personal consciousness, our personal science of the identity goes after we die?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is all wild speculation. I do think that there's a number of lines of research that are important to not just dismiss out of hand. There's research on near-death experiences that some that suggest that individuals are gaining sort of perspectives that they shouldn't really be able to have, although there's also been studies where they put like signs up in rooms, and if you have a near-death experience, can you see the sign that's like up on the ceiling? And so far nobody has done that, but I'm pretty sure if someone's dying, if someone's dead, they're not looking up at the room, they're looking at themselves probably. So they should probably put the thing like on people's forehead, although that might be a little bit invasive. But I think there's that. There's also interesting research on memories and reincarnation, where kids seem to show access. This is work done in the University of Virginia, seem to show access to knowledge of prior lives that they shouldn't seem to have knowledge. And then there, as you mentioned, Arno, there's really interesting stuff about people's experience during dying, where they're sort of having visitations. And I think that actually may be a place that would be, I think, looking at sort of parapsychology surrounding death or dying as people are dying is a very promising thing. There's also, I forgot the name of this situation, where you have particular accomplished meditators who reside in this state of their heart, their body remains warm, their heart is not beating, they don't have rigor mortis. So there's a number of different sort of empirical lines of evidence which raise the real possibility that the relationship between consciousness and the physical body is more complex than we imagine. I think that is suggestive that consciousness or the pattern of consciousness may continue to move. But there's an interesting thing, which is that I think it's also possible that we're actually dying in every moment, that every moment we're a window which is transforming into the next window, which is transforming into the next window. And that next window has that brief moment of dynamic, and then it becomes the next one, and so on. And so even if, say, my memory is making it into another life, maybe it could make it into two different lives. Maybe it branches off into different things. And how does that relate this one to me now? So there's a certain way in which we're perishing and being reborn in every moment. And given that, it almost doesn't matter.
Beautiful. I love that. And I'm going to actually take our top voted question right now from Alicia, who's asking, are schizophrenics tuning into alternate dimensions we can't access? And there are a couple other questions around dimensions. Someone else said, can we tune into other dimensions in meditation? So maybe you can comment a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I love that question. I don't want to romanticize schizophrenia too much, because schizophrenia is associated with a whole host of really, really serious symptoms. And individuals with schizophrenia, I would encourage to stay on their medication and recognize that this is an illness that needs to be managed. That said, there are something called schizotypy, which is sort of on the way to schizophrenia. And schizotypy tends to be associated with creativity. And in fact, if you look at who's, the proportion of people in who's, or I can't remember exactly how the study works, but accomplished people tend to be related to people with schizophrenic. So there may be like a little bit of schizophrenia, a little bit of that sort of on that dimension, which may be quite helpful, or at least helpful with respect to creativity. A concept that I'm very excited about is something known as transliminality, which is the idea of a sort of permeability between conscious and unconscious thought. And when you're dreaming, particularly in the hypnagogic state, right, when you're falling asleep, meditation, altered states of consciousness, all of these may increase our accessibility to this transliminal place. And it's definitely possible that in the transliminal place, you might gain a perspective on these three dimensions of time that is not available to us when we're in our more crystallized perspective. And it's definitely possible that individuals with neurodiversities of different sorts may have a greater access to this transliminal place.
Amazing. So I'm going to take one final question, and then I'll pass it both to Jonathan and Arno for final closing comments. So our next top voted question is from Rogerio, who says, the different temporal perceptions of a fly led me to the same insight you shared about a fly seeing us in slow motion. Doesn't that raise the question of the possibility of existence of life forms that move too fastly for us to see them? Additionally, couldn't we think of different dimensions of the universe are merely different speeds at which different beings are able to move? Maybe spirits are not ethereal or non-physical, they're just moving insanely fast. So I'll leave that one for you to comment on.
Yeah, I think we both watched this, I don't know, but there was a Star Trek, the original Star Trek, where there was exactly that of beings who moved so fast. They sort of sounded like flies that were moving so fast that we didn't notice them. Yes, it totally follows that there could be beings that are moving very, very fast. I should also emphasize that there are beings that could be moving very, very slow. And it may be that plants actually are, again, possibly conscious, but they're moving at a time rate that we just don't appreciate their behaviors. And if you watch plants time lapse, they seem to evoke much more intentionality. And this would be particularly the case if trees are really kind of planted upside down. Their heads are actually their roots, and they're moving and communicating through their roots. So if you were to watch the time lapse of the chemical communication from their through the roots, you might well have a different interpretation of the consciousness of plants. But yeah, I think it's very possible that that we are moving through subjective relative to objective time at different rates, and that causes us to have a very sort of anthropocentric perspective of what's conscious and what's not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you everyone for your questions. And Arno, I'll pass it back to you to start out our closing comments.
Yeah, and my closing comment is just another question for Jonathan. And so the question is reasoning versus experiencing. I mean, right, for an hour, we've been having all this discussion, very theoretical discussion, and hopefully people have been able to follow. But, it's all very conceptual. It's just all thoughts. And what's what's the best way to study consciousness? Is it through these ways of intellectual pursuit and reasoning, or is it like experiencing, just meditating on consciousness and discovering from within what is consciousness, which is obviously much less conceptual, although there are some traditions like the Koan tradition in Zen where you do ponder on a question, but it's just to realize there's no answer to it. So yeah, that's my question. That's my final comments. My question to Jonathan: how to the reasoning versus the experiencing, which is actually a central core, a central pillar of IONS. We have both,
right?
And they obviously complement each other. But what's your take on this?
Well, obviously, from what I've said, I'm going to be wary of saying what the best is, and I think that different people are going to be differently suited for different approaches, and that each person really needs to sort of find the approach that their particular brain, mind, soul, whatever you believe in, is best suited for. So there's no one size fits all. I do think that if you can walk in both realms, that is in the subjective realm of experience and then the intersubjective, finding ways to communicate that with other, that has a particular value. But you'll notice that when I started my incredibly abstract, complex model, I started with fundamental axioms of experience, that consciousness exists, that consciousness is intrinsically dynamic, and that it's happening in the now. So I think that even in the realm of this complex level of abstraction and so on, grounding it in experience, also trying to create a visual model, grounding it in experience, grounding it in our intuitions is really important. And I do think that if you develop these kinds of models, I've meditated and sort of experienced moving through the cone of time with the future coming at me. And so it can actually, engaging in these kinds of discussions can provide representations that can help us to crystallize our own subjective moments, in the same way that I think language may help us to sharpen our thoughts. Gaining these kinds of models and metaphors can help us to have personal experiences that may even have more personal meaning. But I would invite people to experiment for themselves with the alternative approaches and find which one or which combination of one works best for them.
Excellent. And just in our final minute together, any final closing comments for you, Jonathan?
Well, I would just like to say that what oftentimes happens is you have people who are like hard-nosed, material reductionists, and they're always being, and they can't, they're not even willing to have these kinds of conversations. And then you have people who just sort of buy into everything and like, oh, they believe this and that and the other thing, and they're not integrating it with critical thinking. And I don't think that those two perspectives of being open-minded and being critical thinking have to be at odds with one another. And I really would hope that people could try to find a balance where they simultaneously are willing to seriously entertain seemingly radical ideas, but not in so doing throwing away critical reasoning and thinking about things and recognizing that they could be wrong, and entertaining possibilities that are different from the ones that they're looking at. So I hope that our discussion, even if you disagreed with everything that was said, sort of modeling that approach, I think is really valuable. And I would encourage people to think about ways in which they might do that more.
We have 1 more minute, so I want to ask a final question to Jeff. So, will we ever have a solution to the problem of consciousness?
It's certainly possible. My best guess is that we will continue to get ever closer approximations and always have more mystery to uncover. It's possible that when you die, you'll actually, it all becomes clear, and then you forget and have to relearn it all over again. The final thing is, there's a part of me which hopes that we never do. I mean, that we always continue to make progress, but there's always, that may be part of the light. So if we are this, the consciousness having reproducing itself, having gone through the infinite number of big bangs, it doesn't want, it wants to keep things alive. It wants to continue, it would want to continue to have new discoveries and new ways to fulfill curiosity. And so I'm hopeful that will happen indefinitely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Arno, for this enlivening discussion. May we continue exploring. I love the openness and discernment. So thank you for bringing the ideas and models for us to chew on and to discover and explore. And thank you, everyone, for your comments and your questions and joining in this exploration together. So really grateful, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Arno. And just a couple of closing announcements here. We are in our summer vacations mode, which means we'll be taking some Fridays off in July and August from our live webinars. But while we're away, we are going to share some of our best loved archived webinars. So next week's video replay will be Manifesting Science Sheds Light on Intention in the Material Universe. And that's with our Chief Scientist, Dr. Dean Radin. So we'll be sending out an email about that. And then we'll be back the following week on the 23rd. And as always, these free programs, as well as our scientific research, are made possible with the generous support of our members and donors. So a big thank you to everyone on this call who supports the mission of IONS, whether that be giving financial gifts or sharing the webinars, joining in the discussion. It all makes a difference. So thank you for being with us here today. And if you feel inspired, we invite you to go to noetic.org/give to make a special gift or become an IONS member today. So thank you again, Arno. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to everyone who participated. And we will see you all again soon.